I first became aware of Pico Iyer when I read a book of his called The Global Soul, in which he tried to somehow explain the personal meaning of globalization by kind of referring to his own life experience. He was born to South Asian parents. He grew up in the United States, traveled extensively for education, and for his burgeoning career as a journalist, and eventually married a Japanese woman who didn't speak a word of English, and took up residence in a tiny town in rural Japan, from which he traveled incessantly. Planes, trains, automobiles, huge transcontinental, trans-world voyages in order to continue what I think he's still doing, which is writing about the romance between cultures. In any case, when he was here last time, I didn't get to spend much time with him, so I thought I'd ask him back and see what is on his mind this time around. This is Pico Iyer.
Thank you so much, Moses. I really can't tell you how thrilled I am to be back in Toronto, even though Idea City dangerously confirms, I think, my notorious prejudice that this is just the coolest and most imaginative city on the planet. I know your mayor and his Cut the Waste program aren't universally popular, but whenever I come here, I find a mix of hipness and humanity, a sense of future and a sense of past, and a sense of humor and a sense of irony that I really don't find many other places. And I remember the one other time I came to Idea City 10 years ago, at some point I looked around at the other presenters, and I realized every single one of them was either Canadian or in some way officially connected to Canada. And I thought, finally, I have attained my lifelong goal as a great global citizen of becoming an honorary Canadian. For my sins, though, I have to spend a lot of time in California. And not long ago, I found out that there was a teenage girl not far away from me who handles 300,000 text messages in a month. That's an impressive figure, 10,000 a day. If she sleeps 8 hours a night, I really, really hope she does, that means that she is sending or receiving 10 text messages every waking minute of every day for a month. And I thought, well, this is just California, or this is just teenagerhood. But then I read that the average American now spends 8.5 hours every day in front of a screen, or often many screens at once, multitasking, doing many things badly instead of one thing well. And then, of course, I recalled that the average person in a room such as this, even at the end of the last century, was taking in as many images every day as a Victorian did in a whole lifetime. And as I was reflecting on all of this, more and more curious tidbits began streaming in on me. There's a hotel up the road from me in California where they charge $2,215 a night, partly so you can stay in a room where there's no TV. My friends who are interested in the future of travel say that it lies in so-called black hole resorts where people already pay hundreds of dollars a night to hand over their cell phones to the front desk staff when they arrive. Restaurants now famously advertise no Wi-Fi. And my writer friends are always telling me about freedom, isolator, self-control, all these wonderful new programs that allow you to disable the internet for up to 8 hours at a time. And of course, these are the same friends who not many years ago were exulting in being able to access the internet. So it really has begun to seem to me as if we're moving characteristically at lightning speed from having too little information about the world to having too much. And I'm sure many of you have heard of these new conditions such as internet apnea. Nomophobia, literally the medical condition of being terrified of being outside mobile phone contact. In China and Korea, they abduct children and take them to internet rescue camps where they administer literally cold turkey to children addicted to the screen. And it's always seemed to me as if the central conundrum of technology, I suppose, is that it gives us everything except a good sense of how best to make use of technology. In other words, all the data in the world doesn't show us how to sift through data. All the images on the planet don't show us how to make sense of images. The information revolution really came without a manual. And you have to go offline to begin to find the sense of direction and proportion you need to begin to navigate the online world. Except all of us in this room know it's really, really hard to go offline. We need cell phones to remain in touch with our kids. We need email to be in close contact with our bosses and colleagues. If all of us today, enjoying the closing party until after midnight, don't check our email, we realize there's only going to be twice as much email waiting for us tomorrow morning. And what I've noticed is that so many of my friends, and even my bosses, tell me that they have more and more time-saving devices in their lives, less and less time. That they have more and more ways to communicate, and sometimes less and less to say. More and more connections, and yet I think more and more people are feeling disconnected. And there's a sense that people are getting more and more dizzy, I would say, almost reaching the breaking point where it's harder and harder to keep up with a world that's moving at a post-human speed. Not so long ago, a quarter of a second, which is the literal blink of an eye, was regarded as long enough for a search engine to produce its results. Now, even a blink of an eye is regarded as too long. And I should stress, as Moses was saying in his introduction, I'm a great champion of the new world of freedom and mobility. And I think the last time I was at Idea City, I was saying that I really think of the future tense as my home country. I once spent 2 whole weeks living in and around Los Angeles airport, which only a fool somewhat fascinated by the future would ever put himself through. And as Moses was saying, I live in rural Japan for 7 months of the year, and so I'm keenly aware that without phones and email and fax machines, there's no way I could live in the place of my dreams and remain in easy and steady contact with my friends and my bosses. I know that without planes, there's no way I could live in rural Japan and still get back to my 81-year-old mother within 24 hours if I need to. And I think traveling the world a lot, as I do, as you heard, I'm keenly aware that technology has made our lives brighter, happier, healthier, longer, especially I think when I go to impoverished or imprisoned countries, Cuba or Tibet or Burma. You can't help but fail to notice how the internet revolution has given people in those places a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility, a sense of information that was unimaginable to them 15 years ago. And I think for those of us in North America too, for those people who have limited mobility or limited resources, again, it's revolutionized their lives. But I also feel that many of us in a room like this may feel that we almost have too much data, too many choices, too many connections, that technology has given us this terrific sense of freedom, but it doesn't give us boundaries. And I think we need limits because I'm not sure humans are really able to live in infinite space. And so I think so many of us create these crazy not-to-do lists. In my case, I never go online until I've finished my day's writing. I try never to sleep or to work in a room where there is a computer. And before I go to sleep, these days, I try not to be in front of any screen, but I take a walk around the neighborhood, or I have a long talk with my wife, or if she's not around, I just turn off the lights and listen to music as a way to ease me into a quieter state of mind. So as you can tell, what I'm saying is not that I distrust technology, it's that I distrust myself with technology. You know, if you've got a little white box there with an apple on it, and you know that 7 billion, soon to be 9 billion people are ready to disclose their secrets to you, the Library of Alexandria times 1,000,000 is in there, the greatest entertainment center ever devised, how will you ever want to choose your own non-virtual life over all that? And yet I also know that as soon as I go online, it's as if I've been airlifted to Times Square on New Year's Eve, and 10,000 bees are buzzing in my head, and one person is pouring out the story of her life, and somebody else is asking me what to do with his life, and 15 bosses are reminding me of my deadline 3 hours from now, and somebody else, of course, is sending his holiday photos. And a few years ago, when the world began to accelerate, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Pico, you love to travel. I know the perfect place for you." And I'm always a little skeptical when people say that. So I said, "Yeah." He said, no, really, this is not expensive. It's not far away, but it's somewhat different from the places you're used to going. "Yeah, where is it?" I said. "Well," he said, sounding a little sheepish, "well, actually, it's a Catholic hermitage." And I said, "Well, forget it. I'm not Catholic. I'm not entirely a hermit." But my friend wasn't either. He's a school teacher responsible for 16-year-old kids in California. And he said that he took his classes to this monastery every spring. And according to him, even the most testosterone-driven, hormone-addicted, ADD-riddled 16-year-old Californian boy only had to find himself in silence for 3 days, and something in him cooled down and became happier. And according to my friend, many of his students, after 3 days in silence, never wanted to return or didn't want to return imminently. And I thought, well, anything that works for a 15-year-old boy ought to work for me. So I got into my car and I drove 3 hours north, following the ocean, and the roads grew emptier and emptier, and soon it was just meadows running down to the sea and lonely lighthouses on the rocks here and there. And then I turned right onto an even narrower path, barely paved, brown, snaking up to the top of a mountain 2 miles higher. And when I got there was a huge clearing, and in front of me, the great, still blue plate of the Pacific Ocean. And the place was absolutely silent, of course, but the silence was not really an absence of noise. I would say it was the presence of a kind of energy and invigoration. And a monk led me to my small but eminently comfortable room. We were hearing about Benedictine hospitality 2 days ago. And in it, there was a long desk and a huge window looking out on a small walled private garden with a white plastic chair in front of it, and then 1,200 feet of slopes running through coastal live oak and eucalyptus trees to the great blue plate of the ocean. And instantly, I was in heaven. I thought there was nothing that I needed that I didn't have here, that I could do anything at all or nothing at all, that the day was stretching and stretching in the absence of distraction so that it seemed to last 1,000 hours. And this is all ironic because the house that I left to go to this monastery sits at exactly the same elevation, 1,200 feet. It overlooks the ocean, and to anybody seeing it, it would look like the last word in tranquility and secludedness. But of course, when I'm at home, every time I'm trying to write, a part of me is braced for that little chime of "You've got mail" in the next room. And every time I'm trying to read, a part of me is disengaged because I'm waiting for the phone to ring, and so I've interrupted myself, even if the phone doesn't interrupt me. And if I'm ever tempted to sit out at night watching the stars, I think, wait a minute, the Lakers game is on TV and Rachel McAdams' movie is 10 minutes away. No way I'm going to give myself up to these celestial beings. But when I was in the monastery, I was brought to a point. And every now and then a Steller's jay, a blue jay, would land on my splintered fence, and it seemed like the most transcendent, radiant thing I'd seen in ages. Every 4 or 5 hours, a bell would begin to toll very slowly up the slope for me. It seemed to be tolling inside me. And after night fell, I would just take walks down the narrow monastery road and watch the taillights of cars disappear around the headlands 15 miles to the south. And again, I should stress, as Moses said in his introduction, I'm not a religious person. I'm the opposite. I'm a profane journalist. I've been working for Time magazine for 30 years. I never attended any religious services when I was there, but it was just as if in silence, something rose to the top of me, the way that if you put a glass full of water in a sink, the important heavy stuff comes to the top. And after a few days, I knew exactly what I cared about, exactly what I should do in the next 6 months. And I also noticed that there were 13 other retreatants staying there, and most of them, I think, were like me, not Catholic. They were advertising agents, executive vice presidents, psychologists, scientists, teachers, but just coming really to clear their head. And I think there's this sense that we're living these days about 2 inches away from the world. So we get it in all its vibrancy and immediacy, but we can't begin to make sense of it or see the larger picture. It's like being at the Picasso exhibition down the road. If you're 2 inches away from the canvas, you can't really see what the picture is about. You have to step out of your life and step back as far as possible. The worst seat in any cinema is always in the front row. The world is never learnt by learning its details, as Emerson put it. And I worked out at some point that if I took myself to this place 4 times a year for 3 days each, that would come to only 3% of the days of the year, but it would illuminate, transform the other 97%. That if, as I never do enough, I were to sit just quietly, 30 minutes every morning, unplugging, taking a walk, closing my eyes, that would completely revolutionize the other 97% of my waking time. And so indeed, for the last 20 years, I've been going to this place, and as my friend had suggested, it's probably in its way more exciting and adventurous than Bhutan and Easter Island and Ethiopia and all the other wonderful places I'm lucky enough to go to. And every time I go there, most recently 2 weeks ago, there are of course a million reasons not to go. I feel guilty about leaving my wife. 15 of those editors are telling me I have a deadline the next morning. I'm going to miss the Green Day concert. But as soon as I get there, I realize that it's only by going there that I can find anything bright and purposeful and engaged to share with my wife or my bosses or the Green Day concert for that matter. Otherwise, I'm just giving them my fractious, distracted, agitated self, which is really no blessing at all. And I think the reason that I go there in part is that in my field, which is writing, if you think of the great game-changing artists around, Thomas Pynchon, Cormac McCarthy, Alice Munro here in Canada, Don DeLillo, all of them are living a very long way from the world. You're not seeing them on CNN every moment, and that's how they're doing really radical and original work. If somebody asks me why the #1 recording artist on Billboard charts across the globe earlier this year was a 77-year-old poet, I would say that Leonard Cohen, and I know from spending time with him, lives in a great sense of stillness and silence as an ordained Zen monk. That means that the words that come out from him have a depth and resonance that most of our chatter does not. And of course, I'm not suggesting any of you go to a monastery. That's not what this is about. But I do think more and more of us are already trying to find conscious ways to still ourselves, to ground ourselves, to clarify ourselves, and to remind ourselves that there's nothing bad about doing nothing. Because the deeper your rest, the deeper the work that will come out of it. Leonard Cohen is a perfect example. And the last thing that I will share with you, which made a big impression on me, was that in fact, the people who seem most conscious of the limits of technology are the very ones who are living at the heart of the technological revolution. Many of you may know Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired magazine, who's regarded rightly as one of the great prophets of how technology is going to improve our lives in Silicon Valley. Well, Kevin doesn't have a TV in his house. He doesn't have a smartphone. He doesn't have a PDA. He never travels with his laptop. And like many people in Silicon Valley, he and his family observe regularly an internet Sabbath from, say, Friday night to Monday morning, when they never once go online, but just surrender to the beauty and mystery and the wonder of the non-virtual world around them. Of all the companies on the planet, it was Intel, again, right at the heart of the revolution, that mandated 5 years ago 4 hours of uninterrupted quiet time on 300 of its executives and engineers, during which they were not allowed to handle emails, not allowed to make phone calls, I think not even allowed to talk to one another, but just asked to sit in a room, because that's the only way that they could come up with the new inventions that would push this revolution forwards. And I think we all know none of us wants to go backwards. We can't uninvent what has been invented. It seems a safe bet, as Taras was saying about cars, that our devices are only going to accelerate and proliferate in the years to come. And so I think it's really up to us to upgrade ourselves to find out how to make peace with our machines and with our opportunities. Technology gives us a huge amount of content, but it doesn't give us structure. And I think a life of content without structure is a definition of hell. Technology can give us just about everything, but it can't give us meaning, it can't give us soul. And I always remember that story of Mohandas Gandhi waking up one day, and he realized it was a very, very busy day, and he said, there's no way I'll be able to meditate for an hour today. I've got to meditate for 2 hours. Thank you so much.
That's so good.